Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how the principle of progressive overload differs between strength and hypertrophy training. First, let's establish what exactly the principle of progressive overload is. Progressive overload essentially refers to making training harder over time. The training stimulus must disrupt homeostasis to some extent to cause an adaptation of some form. However, as the system adapts to greater stress levels, the stimulus required to disrupt homeostasis becomes greater. If we always provide the exact same stimulus, then we simply won't continue to adapt and improve. Instead, we will maintain the same level of adaptation. So in terms of resistance training, this basically means that we need to train harder over time in order to continue making strength and hypertrophy gains. But what does training harder actually mean? How much harder should we train? What variables do we need to manipulate? And how does this differ between strength and hypertrophy? These are the details we will try to answer throughout the rest of this video. To understand this, we first need to explore what exactly strength and hypertrophy adaptations are. Let's now explore each of these adaptations in more detail. First, let's take a look at muscle hypertrophy. Hypertrophy simply refers to an increase in muscle size. This is primarily achieved through a phenomenon we call myofibrillar hypertrophy. This is when we see an increase in the number of myofibrils, which are the smallest form of contractile tissue in the muscle. As we increase the number of myofibrils, each muscle fiber becomes larger in diameter, which ultimately leads to a bigger muscle belly. This results in a thicker overall muscle, which is the ultimate goal of hypertrophy style training. There are also other adaptations which have been proposed to contribute to muscle growth. These are sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and hyperplasia, but we don't fully understand how prevalent they are in human muscle and to what extent they contribute to muscle growth. So for this video, we aren't going to worry about these. Hypertrophy will just refer to myofibrillar hypertrophy. So what this means is that hypertrophy is a structural or morphological adaptation. This means the goal for hypertrophy training is to change the structure of the muscle tissue, in other words, grow bigger muscles. So it is not a performance outcome, meaning the goal isn't to lift the most weight possible. This will have relevance to the concept of progressive overload when we cover it later in this video. Strength, on the other hand, is a different adaptation. Strength refers to maximizing how much load we can lift, usually for a 1 rep max. We don't care how big the muscle is or how our physique looks, the goal is to simply lift the most amount of weight possible. There are many factors which play a role in maximal strength, although there are two main adaptations which contribute to strength. These are hypertrophy and neural adaptations. Hypertrophy, like we have discussed, refers to an increase in muscle size. Increasing the size of the prime movers of a lift can contribute to strength gains by providing more total muscle mass to produce force. A bigger muscle means that there is more total contractile tissue to contribute to muscle contraction and force production. Neural adaptations, on the other hand, refers to how much force can be produced with the given muscle mass we have. We can learn to produce more force without changing how much muscle mass we have. This is due to several neural adaptations, including improved rate coding, increased motor unit recruitment, greater coordination, and more efficient lifting technique. Neural adaptations are specific to the task we train. This means we must practice the specific lifts we want to get stronger at with heavy loads to maximize neural efficiency. So now we have explored what exactly strength and hypertrophy adaptations are. Next, let's discuss how training for each adaptation compares and contrasts. Although strength and hypertrophy are highly compatible adaptations and have significant overlap in how they are trained, specific training variables may be manipulated in different ways to maximize the response of each. Let's now cover what variables may differ and how they may be adjusted to suit each training goal. The first is exercise selection. For hypertrophy training, there are no mandatory exercises we must perform. We can achieve equal muscle growth outcomes using a range of different exercises for the same muscle group. This is because exercise selection is simply a means to stress the target muscle. However, for strength training, exercise selection is more important. This is because, like we mentioned, neural efficiency follows the principle of specificity. This means that we need to train the exercises we want to become stronger at to maximize neural adaptations. This means that when we want to be at our peak strength, we need to train those specific lifts. The next variable is rep ranges and load. Hypertrophy can be equally achieved across a large spectrum of different rep ranges and loads, provided that sets are taken close to failure. We can train anywhere in the approximate 6 to 25 rep range and achieve equivalent muscle growth on a per set basis. Strength training, on the other hand, is more straightforward. Once again, because neural adaptations abide by the principle of specificity, the rep ranges and loads used have a more direct impact. Essentially, we need to lift heavy to maximize strength gains, so training in the 1 to 5 rep range is probably ideal to maximize neural efficiency. So when lifters need to be in peak condition for strength, it is important to train with heavy loads and lower rep ranges. Next, we have volume. Volume in this context refers to the total number of sets performed per muscle group or per lift each week. Volume appears to be an important variable for hypertrophy training. From the current evidence we have, this seems to follow a dose-response relationship, where more volume results in a faster rate of muscle growth. Provided that we are training with a sufficient proximity to failure, volume appears to be the most influential variable for hypertrophy outcomes. For strength training, this is not necessarily the same case. For long-term strength gains, we do need to achieve significant muscle growth, so volume will be an important factor. However, for neural efficiency, volume is far less important than intensity. This means the number of sets we perform for a lift throughout the week doesn't seem to have much of an impact on short-term neural adaptations. It is far more important to ensure we train the specific lifts with heavy loads than the number of sets we perform per week. However, it should be noted that we still need to train with sufficient volume to grow muscle, which will be a long-term contributor to strength. And the last variable we will cover is interset rest. For hypertrophy training, it seems that interset rest doesn't have a significant impact on muscle growth. There does seem to be a slight benefit for longer interset rest periods, but these benefits are not all that substantial. A general rule would be to rest around 1 to 3 minutes between sets for hypertrophy training. For strength training, rest periods are more important. This is because interset rest will influence acute fatigue and therefore the load lifted. As we have established, it is important to lift heavy for neural strength adaptations, so longer rest periods will be superior to maximize neural efficiency. Essentially, when training to maximize neural efficiency, we want to allow full recovery between sets, which would normally take around 3 to 6 minutes for most free weight compound lifts. So now that we have explored how training for strength and hypertrophy may differ slightly, we can now discuss the concept of progressive overload. While progressive overload is an important consideration for both training goals, their implementation into a program should probably be slightly different. Let's now cover how they can be applied to each training goal and how they may differ. The ultimate goal for strength training is to lift more weight. So for progressive overload, the intent should be to lift more weight over time. If we aren't lifting heavier loads over time, we aren't getting stronger. This doesn't mean we need to increase load lifted every single week. It just means that over time, we should be consistently aiming to increase load on the bar. This will be a result of several different adaptations, including muscle growth, neural efficiency, and technique improvements. But ultimately, these all help us to lift more weight for more repetitions over time. For example, let's say a trainee wants to get stronger at the back squat. Over a 12-week period, a training program may look something like this. As we can see here, the lifter intentionally increases the load lifted and works in lower rep ranges across the 12 weeks. Furthermore, the lifter trains with a higher volume, as calculated by number of sets, in the earlier stages of the cycle and drops volume at the expense of intensity towards the end of the cycle. This will emphasize hypertrophy adaptations earlier in the cycle and maximize neural efficiency later in the cycle to peak. The key factor to note here is that the trainee is intentionally trying to manipulate variables to lift more weight over time. Progressive overload for hypertrophy, on the other hand, is slightly more difficult to understand. Remember, hypertrophy is a structural adaptation, not a performance outcome. So the ultimate goal of hypertrophy training is not to lift heavier loads over time, it is to maximally stress the muscle. Muscle stress is what will cause hypertrophy adaptations, not necessarily the external load that we lift. However, as a muscle grows in size, it also naturally becomes stronger and allows heavier loads to be lifted. So as a result, we should see improvements in reps performed and load lifted over time. This is where it gets somewhat confusing. Essentially, performance improvements should be a result of muscle growth, not a driver of muscle growth. So we shouldn't be chasing strength gains. Strength gains should occur as a result of hypertrophy over time. This means we shouldn't change technique or lift in lower rep ranges for the sake of maximizing how much load we can lift. We should focus on maximizing stress on the target muscle. Then if we see performance improvements over time with the same strict and effective technique, that is probably a good indicator that you have grown muscle in the prime movers. For example, let's use the same lifter to demonstrate how progressive overload can be implemented for the goal of hypertrophy. First, we can see here that we have a leg press rather than a squat because the specific exercise we implement isn't as important. We can also see here that the number of sets performed is greater and remains the same for the entire 12-week cycle. The load is relatively lighter and also doesn't change across the entire cycle either. And most importantly, the proximity to failure is prescribed to ensure each set is sufficiently hypertrophic regardless of the load or rep ranges used. So as the lifter goes through the program, they should naturally see slight improvements in lifting performance over time as a result of hypertrophy adaptations. For example, over an 8-week period, the average number of reps performed fluctuates but shows a general positive trend over time. So rather than prescribing progressive overload naturally occurs as a result of effective hypertrophy training. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.